So just jump up and go. A little bit about ISEC Partners. ISEC Partners is a computer security firm based in San Francisco, Seattle, and New York City. We do pretty much everything to do with security. We do a little bit of everything and a little bit of everything happily. So if you would like to talk to us, please do, especially about a job which we are hiring right now. So let's just jump into the guts, right? So why are we here? Glow caps. Who here has heard of glow caps? Because I sure as heck didn't. Anybody? Raise your hand. Yeah, that's what I thought. Nobody. Okay. And I'm not saying that because this company is bad. This is actually really cool, right? So this company named Vitality came up with this project called Glow Cap, which is just literally a cap that you put on a pill bottle, okay? It's pretty sweet, but it's cellular enabled. So the idea here is that you can actually track pill usage. So if I'm a pharmacist, I'm a doctor, I want to know if you're over-medicating yourself, under-medicating yourself, or, you know, maybe you just forgot. But the issue is that I actually get to know. It's kind of weird, but it's, yeah, I'm not sure if that's a good idea. It could be a good idea, but actually it really helps people, right? Especially when you're talking about like Alzheimer's patients, people that have physical or mental disabilities that disallow them from having regulated medication. So when you really think about it, it's totally a good thing, right? Technology is a good thing for us. We can't be overly paranoid about what we're doing and what we're using. But at the same time, history has shown us that that's not always a good idea, right? We need to step cautiously, step slowly, iterate, right? And this is, as you know, the evolution. Originally, we had a bunch of guys sitting around a mainframe with a timeshare, right? And the closest thing to hacking was Boyd Roberts' version of Terrify Susie. If you don't know that story, please look it up because it's awesome. But we've changed and evolved throughout the years, right? And we've eventually gotten to where we are today, the smartphone. Thumbs up, right? Everybody's essentially walking around with the mainframe in their pocket. That's really cool. And it keeps us connected. It keeps us together. It keeps us gathering statistics, gathering information, thinking about how we can process data in new, amazing ways, right? To understand more about our society, our world around us. And that's exceptional. But at the same time, what's the next step? Yeah, everything is going to be a computer. Your pill bottle, your trees. And don't think I'm lying about that, okay? Because people are actually looking at that. But let's think of actual real-world examples, right? And there are many, 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 many. In fact, if you're a developer in this space, you can jump out to the AT&T website and say, hey, I want to be a developer. What exactly do I need and what spaces are allowed to build my own M2M application? And you'll get a huge list, right? I mean, this is like a page-long list of just industries that you can be in and do cool stuff with M2M. And these are a few of them, right? I mean, you start thinking about these things, you kind of realize that, wait a second, we're opening up a whole new world here. It's not just a world where there are going to be, you know, pieces of the whole. We're talking about the whole, the immediate whole. Because no longer does this affect your credit card, right? It doesn't affect your email spool. It affects Nick DiPetrillo directly, right? Don Bailey directly. These are systems that affect our physical world and impact us immediately, right? And we need to care about that. Because whether you're driving a car, you're using an ATM, or you're dealing with the urban traffic control system, those things have an immediate impact on your day-to-day life. So we need to understand more about the security around these systems. And you know, I could have owned ATMs. As you saw, it was on that list up there, but I think somebody got there first. You might have noticed. I don't know. It's kind of a big talk. So let's talk briefly about elegant attacks over machine-to-machine. Okay? So somebody throw out a random word that you associate with M2M, because I guarantee you I know what it's going to be. Anybody? No, seriously, throw something out there. Anybody? Nick, come on. No? All right. FOTA. Firmware over the air, right? So the most elegant, broad-reaching attacks for M2M are going to be firmware over the air, or pushing new firmware to devices, or attacking the baseband. And I'll talk about briefly why those things are interesting, and kind of reasons why they're not, okay? So, FOTA. Let's dive into this real quick. So firmware over the air is essentially a methodology for embedded systems to receive a firmware update in a secure manner, right? If you've got embedded devices sitting out there in the wild, there's not necessarily anybody there to administer it, right? It could be out in the middle of a field attached to a cow. Seriously. And there are systems where there's a random cow on some network somewhere. And that's pretty awesome. But at the same time, like, who's going to go out into the middle of a field in Missouri and patch that? Probably nobody, right? So firmware over the air is a methodology for actually ensuring that all these applications, all these systems get their firmware update correctly. And it's really cool, but when you think about it from a security perspective, that's like, wow. So at the push of a button, I can own everything. And what's really cool about that is it actually affects multiple types of systems, right? Because these aren't necessarily firmware over the air for one specific device. It could be one specific chipset that is reused over and over by multiple manufacturers, okay? The OEM. It's a big deal here, right? But there are a lot of negatives too. Firmware over the air is very chip specific, okay? Like, you have to really care and take a lot of time to investigate whether your exploit or your methodology of patching is actually going to work correctly on a specific environment. That's a lot of testing time, you know? And Dan Guido has talked about this extensively, where it comes into what exactly is the amount of time that it takes for an attacker to weaponize a vulnerability or an exploit, right? That really has a huge impact on the development lifecycle of the offense, okay? Because we can't expect to be spending a year developing all this stuff, and maybe the next day the entire environment changes because somebody pushed one update that breaks your entire methodology. That's not good for offensive security. And it's a waste of time and it's a waste of money, right? So FOTA has a lot of potential here, but it was almost kind of too big of a deal, right? So the conclusion for this to me was meh, right? It's really exciting, it's really cool, but at the end of the day, do I really care? Probably not, right? Maybe next year, okay? So, basebands. You thought they were local only. Nope. This is where things get exciting, okay? So I initially planned to release baseband exploits this year. But my attack surface wasn't actually basebands, it was M2M in general. So I'm saving this for next year. So our goal for next year is to actually demo multiple baseband attacks on different systems. Of course, that's been done, and been done very well by Ralph Philip Wyman and Grug. Right? They've done a great job in this space. But they didn't look at the remote surface, right? Because a lot of people didn't know it was there. So basebands, for those that don't know, are the chips that actually drive network connectivity between the GSM, right? Or CDMA, or whatever kind of network protocol you have, okay? So it actually ensures that you're connected, drives GPRS, and gets you on the pad and all that other crazy stuff, okay? So attacking the baseband usually means you have to be in physical proximity. You have to have a USERP or some other kind of slick device that points at your target and says, zap, I'm going to attack you. And your phone's like, oh no, oh my God, exploit. And so, you know, it's a really cool way of owning somebody, but at the same time, it's really difficult to do without being right next to somebody. Okay? But with this technology, I can now own your baseband remotely because it has TCP IP stack embedded. That's sick, right? That is so freaking cool. And it has all these protocols. So it's not just straight up TCP IP, it's HTTP, FTP. You can, you know, infect somebody via HTTP chunking. Who remembers the gobbles exploit from back in the day? Yeah, you could do that over baseband. It's awesome. So, you know, this is a really cool space to play in, and we're going to in the future. But the issue here is that the benefits kind of were under the negatives, right? Because again, it's kind of like FOTA. It's extremely chip specific. It takes a lot of engineering time, and really this isn't what the attack was about, right? We want to own systems elegantly, but we also don't want to spend too many cycles actually doing this. Because, you know, we're consultants. We don't have a lot of time to spend on research. We do what we can. So the idea is to do something elegant, quick, and impactful. So the conclusion of this methodology is, as you would expect, sharks with lasers on their heads, right? It's really freaking cool. You would love to have a shark with a laser on its head, but do you really need it? Probably not. But man, I really want one. So anyway, the last idea in those that set of three ideas is attacking the APN. So for those that don't know, the APN is actually the network that you join over the data packet network, right? So when you get on GSM, you then re-authenticate into GPRS, and it drops you in a specific APN. And that APN is associated with a particular name, and that could be, CID agps.tmobile.com or whatever for a certain type of tracking device or something else, etc. And your authentication mechanism is actually the SIM, but you are essentially dropped into a virtual private network, right? So you get an IP address over point-to-point, and you can now interact with other devices on that network. Servers, endpoints, what have you. So of course, there's always the idea that you can just, attack the internet and then jump into the APN, and therefore you've owned the APN, you've owned M2M. Well, yeah, I guess that's true, right? But it's kind of like having an LTE talk and saying, we're going to own LTE, but then attacking the LTE internal virtual private network over the internet and saying, I've owned LTE. Like, no, you really haven't. You've owned the internet, which I heard people can do with SQL Map right now. I don't think that's novel. So the benefits here were none. It's not interesting. You've heard it before. I'm not going to waste your freaking time. Okay? I already don't deserve a room with this many people. This would be far worse. So we'll just talk about what we should be doing, right? But it's important to talk about those other methodologies to understand where are the real potential impact points, right? That's not a waste of time. It's important for us to understand the overall impact. And we can't do that without investigating what we should or shouldn't do, right? That's the whole point of threat modeling, is taking that time to understand what's going on. So, after a time check, here is what we're looking at. The good old machine-to-machine module. This is a system provided by Microchip. It's actually pretty cool. It's got ye old GPS module on it, ye old uBlocks GPRS module on it, some other chip that's driving the GPS unit, and a bunch of pins. Looks pretty standard. It's PCB. There's a PIC32 on the other side of that board. Okay? So what's interesting about this is it's cheap. It's easy to manufacture. It uses common chips, common form factors, very easy to get a hand of or a hold of. So it costs virtually nothing from the actual manufacturer's point of view and from the client's point of view, right? So let's find the commonalities in this architecture that actually allow us to exploit M2M, right? So there are two main primary components here, because you don't necessarily need GPRS, or I'm sorry, you don't necessarily need GPS, right? You just need the GSM module, really, in a microcontroller to drive it. Because in this case, the baseband only handles network connectivity, right? It only gets you on the pad. So it can't drive application logic. It's not going to do all the processing for you, even if it has a Java virtual machine in it. So you need another microcontroller, okay? And that secondary microcontroller is usually extremely small. But it drives the business logic. And says, I'm going to unlock this door, or I'm going to open the security gate, or I'm going to flood this dam. Literally, right? So the commonality here is that every single one of these systems that's approved by a provider, whether it's T-Mobile or AT&T or whoever, it has to be pre-approved modules, okay? So you always know the set of basebands that's going to be used by any given manufacturer. That's awesome. And additionally, all the providers publish these lists online. So you can download them and say, oh, hey, there are 30-some basebands for Centurion. Cool. So now I know every single system that I have to compromise in order to get code execution on any virtually any M2M system, right? But the architectural issue is that these two devices have to talk somehow. That's the commonality, right? The microcontroller has to pass information back and forth between the baseband because unlike modern phone architectures like the iPhone or your Android or whatever, these CPUs don't share memory, which means that they have to pass information back and forth over a very simple bus. Who wants to guess what that bus is? Serial. Like, oh my God, AT commands? Really? That's awesome. Because guess how easy I can sniff your AT? Yeah. So these are some actual requests from devices to basebands, right? The top, you actually see HTTP, that's a client command. You've also got SISS, which is a raw TCP connection, no protocol there. USORF is UDP socket receive, so they're actually trying to emulate socket functionality like you would in a Unix environment. It's pretty cute. And then you additionally have, your normal AT commands for SMS. Hey, show me all the new SMS that are coming in over baseband. Make sure that I get a notice or some kind of alert when stuff comes in. Thumbs up. So let's jump in a little bit to the payload of what's inside that AT stuff, right? Because all the data that you care about is going to be a parameter of that AT command. Because again, we're shipping data back and forth over the baseband, which has a TCP/IP stack, right? So obviously you're shipping data, you're pushing HTTP, right? This is very easy stuff. So there are only so many ways that a microcontroller that's extremely small, like 8 bits, barely any RAM, barely any flash space, there's so many ways that it can generate a key, right? Because these systems have like no entropy. On the AVR architecture, Atmel's AVR, it's an 8-bit microcontroller, works really well, and is used very heavily, especially you may be familiar with it being in your TPM modules. They drive your TPM for Lenovo, but it's an actual 8-bit microcontroller that you can own the hell out of. Pretty cool. But one thing to note is that that architecture itself, the entropy is so small you can only generate 8 random bits per second. Exactly, that guy gets it. So when you think about it from that point of view, how long do you think they're going to wait to generate a key? They're probably not going to. So they're going to use values that you can get a hold of, like the IMSI, which is stored on the SIM. That's supposed to be a secret that's only shared by the SIM card and the network, even though it's transmitted once during authentication to the GSM network, right? In some applications, they don't even decide to encrypt at all. They just ship data over AT. Oh, hey, here's my HTTP post. By the way, I'm at these specific GPS coordinates. Is that cool? Okay, thanks. Right? So if we do have encrypted data, how do we analyze it? Very simply, right? I just said there are a finite number of ways they can generate a key. But most importantly, we just actually extract the firmware. Because again, this is 8-bit microcontrollers, or a PIC32 or something that's probably pretty easy to compromise. If you're Travis Goodspeed, you could probably do it in 5 seconds, right? So if you have a good FET, and good FETs are super awesome, you can probably just use glitching or maybe hack DPA-SPA into it and just call it a day, right? But to get started, we can just simply sniff the AT. So of course, we just look at baseband data sheets and say, oh, here's the UART, TX, and RX. Let's sniff that, right? Really simple. If you don't have the data sheet for the microcontroller, you don't need it. Because all you care about is the UART, and it's tied directly to the baseband. What else do you need to figure out? Right? So you can figure out very easily what those pins are. It doesn't take any time at all. And if you really need to, you can say, okay, now I know what 4 pins are. TX, RX, VCC, and VSS. And then you can brute force the rest with a good FET. Just as a side note, at Hack in the Box Kuala Lumpur later this year in October, I will be releasing the AVR port of the good FET, which additionally includes a JTAG scanner, which is what I'll be presenting at Hack in the Box. So you'll be able to brute force scan for JTAG using the good FET, which is cool. I mean, it's been done before, but it's important, right? So you can use that to now figure out exactly what's going on in these chips. And we just use the logic analyzer and get the rest of the data, right? The UART is very simple. It's not complicated. They just do standard 8 and 1. It's 9600 or it's 115. But you have to be sure to sample data at both 96 and 115 because at 9600 there are some interesting initialization things that occur, especially on first boot. Like, hey, I'm going to ask the SIM card to encrypt this payload, and then I'm going to ship it out so that the network authenticates me and realizes that I'm a real SIM. That's cool, but you're going to want to capture that, right? So ensure that you do both. So here's a little logic analyzer, just if you haven't seen one or played around with one. The top actually shows you the data, and you can see how simple this is, right? Because I just used a filter to parse async, and now you can actually see ASCII at the top. I mean, that's what? C36-GD. Really straightforward. So you don't have to spend a lot of time doing it. And this is the actual output. Anybody notice anything weird about that output? Throw it out there. What do you see? Yeah. HTTP, an actual IP and port. Oh wait, it's not encrypted. Oops. So, assuming you actually don't have an in-the-clear payload to make you super happy and do a dance, you have to figure out how to do some reversing, right? So again, this is pretty simple stuff. All we have to do is determine what the crypto keys are. And the protocol itself might be dynamic, but we can figure it out because we can do statistical analysis on the payloads, right? Because again, these don't have a lot of entropy. And then of course we have nonces, which if you're actually performing an attack, the nonces sometimes get in the way, right? But there are ways to get around that, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So, some light hardware hacking, as I alluded to earlier. Simple differential power analysis is huge here, especially on these microcontrollers. If they are using a static key, come on, you can do this with these kinds of things all day, right? 8-bit microcontrollers have virtually no protection from that attack. Glitching works great. You can do simple blue wire fixes because a lot of the PCBs are designed to be put into debugging mode. It's great stuff. So you don't have to take a lot of time to do any of that. Also, I just want to mention that the AVR and ST do have a secure line of microcontrollers that do protect, or they purport to protect against SPA and DPA and some glitching. And they actually say that in documentation. The problem is that these things, the cost of those chips is so high, nobody wants to use it. Why would I use that chip when I can pay $1 for an AVR that has no protection at all? Right? I'm going to go for cost over security every time. So reverse engineering is extremely simple once you actually have the firmware, right? The code base is very small. The vectors are predictable because they all have the same format. At the very beginning of the firmware payload, you actually have interrupt vectors and the reset vector, which points you to the main application. It's not like the Linux kernel or iOS where you have to do so much more work to actually figure out what the main program is, right? So it takes no time at all. The opcode architecture is extremely simple. Again, this is 8-bit. I mean, like the ST architecture has like 96 instructions. It's not that hard to figure out what those things are and the patterns in these opcodes to extract and analyze and disassemble them, even if you don't have tools. And of course, there's no MMU, so you don't have to walk page tables or figure out where are delimitations between this segment of memory and that segment of memory. So let's take the STM8 as an example. Everybody uses this chip. I've found it in so many different M2M systems. It's awesome. So it's got a 24 megahertz clock, and as you can see, that is not fast enough to do anything novel from a cryptographic point of view, right? There isn't going to be a big number library on this system. There isn't going to be Diffie-Hellman, obviously, because there's no big number. There's not going to be RSA, because there's no big number library, et cetera, right? So here is a little disassembler that I wrote myself, because in the STM8 architecture, the access to information is kind of low. Right? Well, I mean, you have a huge amount of access to information. You don't have a large amount of access to tools. So I was actually flying to Indonesia for, big shouts out to IDSecConf. But I was out there a couple weeks ago, and I decided I really need to reverse engineer this firmware super fast. So I need to write my own disassembler. It literally took me from the time that I took off to the time that I actually got to Palembang, Sumatra, three days later to finish my disassembler to get it to a point where I could actually use it effectively to reverse engineer the entire firmware architecture, or the firmware itself. Which sounds like it might be, cool, but honestly, if I can do it, other people can do it way faster. But that's the whole point about these architectures. It's extremely lightweight. You're supposed to be able to figure out what bit associates with a certain memory address or a certain memory loading technique very quickly. And you can see here, the way that I dump is that you've got, the ASM mnemonic followed by the actual address of that code, and then the opcodes involved. So you can see the reset vector is a certain address, and then other things at other specific addresses. And just to note, this is an example firmware that I've created myself, so I'm not actually exposing anybody's software here. But you'll notice a couple of things. The UARTs actually have an address where they're processing real data, right? The reset is always required because that's your main application program. So you know exactly where things are going to be. And what's most important is the UART, because the UART vector actually shows you, oh, I'm going to snag this data out of this data register and throw it somewhere in memory. And that's really important because you need to know where in memory the main application is going to retrieve that byte of data. So that immediately tells you where in the main code it's going to start processing commands straight from the baseband. So you don't have to spend a lot of time spinning your wheels. It's extremely quick for you to be able to accomplish the reverse engineering of a firmware just by identifying where that information is stored. So that's a simple trick for you if you're doing reverse engineering to quickly get the details that you need. So here's an example of all the addresses that the other vectors jump to. And this is really important because this will save you a ton of time reverse engineering, right? If you notice that all the other vectors are jumping to the same address, that address probably does nothing, right? That just means that that functionality of the chip isn't being used, okay? So then you jump back. It's just an IRET means interrupt return, return from interrupt, right? Essentially this function just processes nothing and moves on. So this is the most interesting part that I was talking about earlier, where you actually have to find in the firmware where it's extracting the byte from memory, and that memory is a memory-mapped register for the UART data register, right? And then we store that information somewhere in memory. So this is just a simple example of how easy it is to find this on the ST architecture, right? So on ST, you literally just have a load from a static address, 5231, that's always the same. So we can actually scan for that opcode set, C65231. Bam, done. And the instruction the vector that it returns to just stores the accumulator value or the UART byte somewhere in memory, and then you can scan for that access to that memory address in the main application. Done. It's very easy. So disassembling and emulating is extremely easy, especially on this architecture. You have few registers. It's almost a CISC. It's risky, but it's CISC-y, right? So you only have like 6 different registers. They're all 16-bit and 8-bit. Very simple stuff. The instructions, again, are very easy to decode. A common bit always represents a certain type of load or store. And they only use one mnemonic, load. There is no store, right? They just reverse the load. Emulation requirements are extremely minimal, which means that you could write your own emulator in a short amount of time, okay? So injecting interrupts is super simple because all you have to do is create a memory buffer and then throw bytes in that memory buffer and say, jump to this interrupt address. Then you're done. It's really easy. So this is an example of my emulator. As you can see, I'm jumping through instructions here with the S command, which is step, okay? And then at the very end, I just show you the registers. And I'm sorry, it's a little bit off there. But you can see the registers, right? So 17FF, that's also really important. So one thing to note that you always want to make sure that you're actually decoding instructions correctly. A really big tip. If you're disassembling the main function and the first thing it doesn't do is load the stack pointer, you've written your disassembler incorrectly. So usually every microcontroller architecture will actually perform that step first because it has to, right? It has to set up the stack. So that's a really great way for you to say, yes, I'm parsing correctly, okay? So I will be releasing this stuff GPL'd so that you guys that are now going out and looking at M2M have tools that are open source and easy for you to hack up if you need to start doing your own M2M reverse engineering. Also in Hack in the Box KL, I'm going to be adding a SWIM module to GoodFet, which SWIM is single wire interface, right? So it's the debugging port. It's kind of like debug wire if you're familiar with Admel AVR, okay? So I'll be releasing methodology for using or interfacing with that at Hack in the Box. So the entire point of reverse engineering, the reason why I went through this and showed you some tips and tricks is because we have to get to the details, right? And the detail here is what commands are actually being parsed. You know, sometimes you can just run strings on a firmware image and it'll show you, I'm expecting these. But a lot of the times you're going to be dealing with binary protocols. So it's not going to be that easy, right? You can't just run strings for a bunch of binary opcodes that you don't know what the heck they are. So this is really important. And once you actually disassemble and reverse the portion of the firmware that actually interprets the UART commands, you can see that it's, if it's receiving SMS, the SMS is expected in this particular binary format. Then you can follow what it expects, and if there's logic that's flawed. So if it's ASN1, and God forbid there's ASN1 in an SMS packet, or if it's TLV, you can see, oh, hey, it's not interpreting the length correctly. I can totally overflow that. And on architectures like this, it's extremely easy to get code execution. So that's a really important step, an especially important step because you need to develop your own protocol in order for interacting with these devices. Right? So the communication channel allows you to identify specific commands, but it also allows you to build particular payloads. Right? So I alluded to that. I was talking about specific orders of binary opcodes. But there are tricks. Right? The cool thing about doing it this way instead of like trying it the easy way is that you actually get to see that there are debugging commands that you can access that aren't typically sent over the RF. Right? So that's an excellent opportunity for you to exploit debugging commands or administrative commands that have been left there for super users of the network. Or maybe even an engineer forgot to remove it. That's actually quite popular on these systems because once you have a firmware that works, you don't necessarily want to touch it. Right? So you don't want to edit any of the code out. But you're building a strategy for attack here. So the next part, after you actually build yourself a protocol for interacting with these devices, is to figure out how to find them. Right? Because if we can't find these devices, it doesn't mean anything to us. We've just built a weapon that doesn't have a target. So here's the next part. This is really cool stuff. So Nick DiPetrillo and I, during the Carmen Sandiego project, developed a methodology called device profiling. We were able to do it over the telephone network to actually identify places on the network where interesting things lived. Okay? So there are keys to this, and they're listed here. It's actually very simple, but it's extremely powerful. The most important things that you'll note are what network, what provider is this M2M using, because they all have a contracting license with a particular provider. AT&T, T-Mobile, whatever, right? And for one device that I'll show you later, the provider was T-Mobile, okay? So all I had to do was scan HLR for every single device or every single phone number that actually HLR responded and said, it's on T-Mobile. Thumbs up, okay. So what's next? We just figure out the next steps. Like if it's M2M in a particular deployment, it can't receive phone calls. So then call the freaking numbers. See which ones give you an error. And then oh hey, this is probably M2M, right? So you can get a lot of data from these kinds of systems without ever actually poking the telephone number itself. Like you can call it, but there are a lot of other ways to get the information, right? So if voice is allowed, great, that's easy to do, but also caller ID is almost more important, especially on the T-Mobile network. So if we extract caller ID from a bunch of phone numbers, say 100,000 phone numbers, and we scan, we say, which ones look weird? Usually on the T-Mobile network, you'll see that every single caller ID actually associates with a person's name, or the billable unit, the billable person for that account, right? So if you're a father, and your kids all have T-Mobile phones, you'll actually see that your name is the caller ID entry for every single one of your kids' phones because they're on the same plan as you, right? So when you scan through the network, you scan through these telephone numbers, you'll see unavailable, unavailable, unknown, unlisted. Those are the things you want to pay attention to because that means it's either M2M or a prepaid phone. And those are both interesting for different reasons, but the unavailable and associated with M2M is great because now you have a direct phone number that is your target, and you can start sending SMS to it. And the way that you differentiate between prepaid and an actual M2M device is, again, you can just simply call it. But the idea is to whittle down phone numbers. Instead of calling 100,000 phone numbers, which wastes a ton of money and a ton of time, you can whittle down your set to maybe 1,000, maybe 700, maybe 500, okay? And HLR used to be an awesome resource for this. So one thing that Nick and I noticed is that during analysis of device profiling, right, we could actually see that M2M systems were never in the place that the MISDN was allocated. So when you turn on a device and enable it, it actually gets a phone number, right, stored on the SIM. And that phone number for T-Mobile is totally random when you're M2M. And that's really interesting because now I can scan for a certain fingerprint that shows HLR shows that the mobile switching center is in Florida. But this device is never in Florida. It's always in Denver, Colorado. That's a really big tip-off that this device is M2M. And what's really cool about that methodology is you never have to touch the provider network. You touch some third-party SMS HLR provider over in the EU that does all the hard work for you, right? So it's really hard to detect that as an information gathering mechanism, okay? The physical fingerprint is also extremely interesting because say you want to steal a car, right? You want to be able to stand in front of a vehicle and say, this car is enabled with a security module, right? So the physical fingerprint is almost as important, if not more so. Because once you've whittled down your hundreds of thousands of numbers into 500, you want to know which out of that 500 can I attack today, right? So some interesting thing about the physical fingerprint is we can use Grug's attack, which is just the IMSI detach attack, to force a lot of these phones off the network and to get them to reassociate. Hopefully we'll be able to intercept the IMSI and see what kind of IMSI is floating back and forth between device and network. When we do that, we can see something very interesting. The IMSIs associated with a lot of these M2M deployments, specific wireless vendors. Jasper Wireless, huge. They do all AT&T's deployments, pretty much. Okay? So if you see a Jasper SIM, by seeing a Jasper IMSI, that's probably a device that you care about, right? So you can watch that. Another big thing is with the zoom back, when I reverse engineered that, I was like, wait a second, this module is weird. Why does the MC56, every time it attaches to the network, it only says, I'm capable of A52? Not A51, not A53, just A52. That's not cool. But it's a fingerprint because we shouldn't even be seeing that on the network anywhere. Your phone isn't capable of A52. It sure as heck shouldn't be, right? So I know that's not a phone. It's some kind of weird device. So those two things together will tell me where and what a device is in my physical location. Okay? And then using RSSI, of course, I can start figuring out where that device is. So the whole reason behind this, the reason why Nick and I were looking at it is because SMS is extremely noisy. And we start sending a lot of SMS messages, we realize that, oh, the network is actually starting to drop us. They're no longer allowing us to send packets on the network. But we can't tell. They just kind of go into a black hole, right? Because we're not on the other end, we're not on the phone number that's receiving the messages. But we're thinking, wait a second, statistically I should be seeing more responses. But I'm not. So what's going on? There's a huge problem with spam, as we all know. And they've kind of screwed researchers in this way, right? So you've got all these messages that you want to send. You can't send all of them, because if you do, you start getting dropped by your provider. And you could be getting like roto messaging, SMS submit, whoever your provider is, screwed, right? So they're going to start dropping you too, because they don't want to tick off T-Mobile or whoever, right? So device profiling is essential because it allows you to whittle down those numbers to a set that you can get away with. I can send 500 500 SMS in the span of maybe a couple hours, completely undetected, nobody's going to care. If I start sending more than that, people are going to start to get annoyed, especially if those messages all have very similar content. Because then, their software is going to say this looks like spam. So we have simple profiling tools that will be released, and I'll talk about where they're going to be released at the end of the talk. And they'll actually show you how to do this. They're very simple scripts. Just reach out to the network and allow you to pull the information into a SQL database that you can just do different kinds of data processing techniques on. So it's really slick, but this is really all you need to start getting going, right? It's not really more complex than this. So here's an example of the tool. This is literally just some random phone number I pulled out of the air, right? But you can see that it's effective. So for any random phone number, we just ask roto messaging, give me the HLR data. And the HLR data says 310.016, which is the Cricket mobile network in the United States. So I know this phone number is live because it's not absent subscriber. I know what network it's on, which means I know I can send messages to it. And I also have her name, Virginia Woolf or whatever, right? So I can see who that individual is and whether it's M2M or not, right? So that's pretty cool. And when you start scanning through hundreds of thousands of phone numbers, you can eventually get to Charlie Sheen's phone number, which I'll call it later if you want, because he's fun to harass. So let's do a quick example of device profiling on the iPad, okay? So this was a really elegant example of how to find iPads on the telephone network. What was really interesting is that I could find iPads all day, but obviously that doesn't mean I can own them over SMS, right? They're probably not listening. I've never tried because, honestly, Stefan Esser is pretty much dominating that area, so I don't want to step on his toes. And I probably couldn't anyway because I'm not as skilled as him in that area. But the provider itself is AT&T, right? We know that because we know AT&T is deploying the iPad, okay? So we know that the caller ID, in this case, you sign up for a subscription on the iPad, right? You type in your credit card number and then say activate, and it activates, and you're good. So it's actually associated with your name, right? So I can scan and see, oh, Don Bailey, there I am in the caller ID list. But the trick is, the way that I differentiate it between a phone and a machine-to-machine device is simply by calling it. If you call an iPad, you get an error that says, you cannot call this number, please stop it, right? So that immediately tells you, oh, wait a second, what's the most widely deployed e-reader on the AT&T network? Yeah, iPad. What? Yeah, it's pulled from your credit card info.
So it is the identical name as appears on the credit card that they use to sign up? That's a big deal for this.
Well, I actually can't tell, right? Because I don't have enough information. Like, I'm not owning people's credit cards, so I can't. But that is a really good question. Maybe somebody could answer that at a later time. So, that was a whole lot of crap we just went through, right? If you want to get up, stretch your legs, that's fine. I'm not going to get mad. But we'll just go ahead and jump into the overall strategy, right? So let's just reiterate. The idea is this. We identify target industries, water treatment, SCADA, vehicles, whatever. And then we determine what kind of processors are being used in that space, right? Are there forum posts where people are, logging on to Atmel's forums and saying, hey, my M2M sucks at doing this. Why is that? You can find that information out really easily. And in a lot of cases, you'll just see like news bites that say, hey, so-and-so company just partnered with so-and-so chip manufacturer to build such and such device. So you can easily just figure this out in a matter of seconds. Like do a little Googling and you're done. Then we just intercept the initial command set after we get a demo unit or we buy one, right? And then we just do simple hardware attacks like SPA, DPA, glitching, whatever, to pull down firmware. Or we get the crypto keys, if there are any. And then we extract the command from the firmware by reverse engineering, build whatever tools we need in a short amount of time, identify the command channels, whether it's SMS, whether it's GPRS, or whether it's voice. Some are voice capable. And then you just go for it, right? You figure out your network fingerprint, and bam, you go for it. So let's do a little case study real quick and show you how this actually went down. So the Zoom Back is a very interesting little device. I love this thing. This was my first M2M hack because I had no idea what I was doing with hardware reverse engineering before this. And I will thank a lot of people that helped me along the way at the end of this talk. But this is literally just a small consumer tracking device. Okay? Nobody knew who the heck this thing was before Oprah went on and said, hey, you know what's really cool? You can track your kids and make sure they're safe. To do that, use this little small device that you can throw in their backpack, and now they're super safe, and you can track them online with the Web 2.0 interface. Thumbs up. I heard that and thought, oh dear God, no. Please, Oprah, no. No, Oprah, no. So, of course, this was my first target, right? It was like, that's dangerous. That can definitely be owned. Let's own that thing. Okay? So the architecture is simple Renaissance SH microprocessor. Actually a pretty robust microprocessor, Holds a lot of data, I forget off the top of my head, but that's actually because in this case I didn't have to reverse engineer anything. Because like I said earlier, dear Oprah, no, Oprah, no. There's no confidentiality used on this device whatsoever, so I didn't have to care, right? The Centurion wireless module is MC56. I had mentioned this earlier, only capable A52. So they spared like no expense with this project. Okay? And then, of course, there's a little GPS module on it, which is pretty standard. So I just went through the whole rigmarole, right? Let's intercept some SMS commands. Let's intercept some AT and figure out what's going on. Well, the most interesting thing is that it actually was binary, right? So I couldn't just straight up like text message it and be like, give me your datas, right? But I had to do a little work. But it wasn't that much work, but I'll show you. So some interesting things about this, the way that you know it was assisted GPS is it actually constantly pulls the baseband for what are all the towers around me, what's the RSSI, and how well, I think there's some telemetry stuff that I don't quite understand. But anyway, that information is all gathered constantly from the baseband and then shipped back to the main servers, okay? So they're actually doing data gathering, mining at the same time as they're deploying these systems, which is really interesting if you think about it, because AGPS really means that you're assisting them, they're not assisting you, right? Because your device is telling them what all the towers are around, because they don't necessarily want to pay for the database that AT&T sells or T-Mobile sells or whatever. I don't know, Patrick, is that for sale? No? Yeah, so they have to gather that information themselves, right? So you're actually helping them. Well, what happens if GPS, if there's cloud cover, right? Just real quick, let's think about this. If there's cloud cover, or you're inside a building or parking garage, there isn't going to be GPS, right? So what do you do at that point? You send up RSSI for all the towers around you. So let's think about that. If they don't know what towers are being used until you tell them, anybody see where I'm going with this? Exactly. So what I did was, and I forgot to put this slide in, but I showed it at Source Boston, what I was able to do is I was able to flood the network with disinformation about specific towers to say that they were in Abbottabad, Pakistan. And then I literally queried myself over their Web 2.0 interface, and there I am, smack dab at Obama's compound. Oh wait, I said Obama. My bad. But you get the point. So again, let's go back to this image, right? Bam! HTTP post. All that data you see right there. Assisted GPS data, right? IP address, port. Now I know where to ship all the information to, so I don't even need to zoom back. I can just write a flutter and just, bloop. Here's a bunch of data. Process this, please. Very simple. Here's the SMS payload. As you can see, it's binary, right? So you have to do a little bit of processing, but it's extremely easy. And there is one key in there. You see three primary things. G on delocate, which specifies the command to use, right? Tell me where your infos is. Loc34- whatever, that's your NOTs. That's the session ID that's sent back to the server, okay? And then C.P. I was like, what the heck is that thing? That looks weird. It doesn't look like the rest of the data. So I decided to say, hey, Don, you know what would be really cool? Is if there was an IP address embedded inside the SMS. Guess what it is? And it actually is owned by Zoomback. So of course, me then trying to be creative thinks, hey, what happens if I replace that IP address with a different IP address? What would that do? So I just kind of devised a little tool, a little script, interface with SMS submit, and then bam, shipped it over Channel. What do you got? A network fingerprint. I should have talked about that, but I'm going to skip it because you don't care. This is the script. You can download it from the website at the end of the presentation. Okay. So this is the script I use to own every single Zoomback on the network. 72% success rate. Okay. So when I actually perform the device profile, which I'm not going to talk about because who cares, I actually received a 72% success rate of all the devices that I could force to call back to me. Okay. That's a huge success. And this is the result. Bam! Random devices connecting to me and shipping me their payload. Awesome. So now what I was able to do, I was able to find every single one of these devices on the telephone network, literally every single one, and force them all to tell me where they were every 5 minutes. Not only that, because I reverse engineered it, I understood how the messages could be shipped and just started shipping my own messages. So now I can actually additionally impersonate random people on the network. Hey, your car is suddenly in Afghanistan. Watch out for that landmine. And there I am. And as you can note, my GPS infos have me in a particular parking spot. Sweet. Of course, that's Google Maps, so that's not actually my car, but you get it. So, we're running out of time here, so let's move on to the thing you've all been waiting for, because this is what actually filled this room, because I apparently got a lot of hype. But thanks to Kelly Jackson and Eleanor and Mills for that, by the way. You guys are awesome. So let's look at the car security module real quick, right? So we have the exact same strategy for the Zoomback. We did this with several devices. The Zoomback was really important because it was completely in the clear. Okay? The car security module was additionally really important because it was the exact opposite. It was very hard to own the car security module. Okay? So these were two really interesting case studies that allowed us to see that yes, even if you do things better than ZoomBack, and I'm always going to use ZoomBack as like the low bar now, if you always do things better than they did, you can still fail. And it's because of the architecture, right? So we performed all these same tricks, did a little reverse engineering, took a look at the firmware, extracted the commands by reverse engineering the payloads, right? And then we figured out how to device profile this specific device, and then we decided to attack it. So what is the overall result of this? Bam! You've got a really happy Vin Diesel at the end of that comic. So to illustrate this more eloquently, I'm going to ask my research partner, Matt Solnick, to come up and show a little video.
Oh, thanks, Don. Also, I'd like to thank ISEC Partners for the opportunity to do this awesome research. This video has actually been edited in accordance to our responsible disclosure policy while the vendor is currently mitigating the vulnerabilities. On that note, here it is.
Watch the audio level.
Here we are with the 1998 Subaru Outback with a security and control system installed. This system includes
So our goal here is essentially to bypass authentication and authorization, right? So we want to manipulate the car security module remotely. First we want to be able to find the module, then we want to be able to unlock the module, then finally we want to be able to ignite the engine or start it remotely. Okay? We'll demonstrate that now. First thing we'll do is show you that the car is actually locked, then we'll unlock it. So I've issued the unlock command, and it takes a second. There you go. All right. So I've issued the start command. It'll take a second. There you have it. So I apologize for the gratuitous video at the end of this. There's actually a reason why we had to show it. That's why. Thanks, Matt. Did we close out the... Man, I suck at Mac. How do I get the... Cool. Thanks, Matt. So, of course, the end result, yeah, things are difficult. And they're not going to get better anytime soon, right? But the fact is, we have baselines. We have methodologies, and we have tools to get better. There are a lot of very easy things that you can do to make this simple. Use crypto, right? That's not a hard one. Let's just ensure that everybody has a standard where they have to use crypto. Ensure APN security. Make sure devices can't talk directly to each other and own somebody's baseband, right? Because that's a big deal. And essentially, another issue with that is that you can also attack the microcontroller directly, right? If it can accept commands over GPRS. So don't embed an IP address in an SMS, because that's just dumb. All right? So that's another obvious one. Nonces are always essential. They should be negotiated on initialization. And decrease, I really want Admel and ST to decrease the prices of their security modules, which is probably going to happen normally over a process of time because the microcontroller industry is going insane, right? So they're just growing exponentially every year. So we'll probably see that happen anyway. And we need more Java VM-enabled systems deploying PKI, SSL, and HTTPS. Right now, we're not seeing that as much because of cost. So if you look at like the available Centurion modules on AT&T, they're like 30, give or take. But there are only like 4 that are enabled with Java VMs that are capable of this stuff. So we need more of that. All the tools for this can be downloaded later this afternoon at wartexting.org. We'll probably have the video up there too. So all the stuff that I've discussed, all the tools will be there either later today or after I recover from drinking. So at some point. So I'd just like to thank everybody on this page for their incredible help, especially ISEC partners and Alex Stamos and my good friend Matt Solnick. Thanks to Nick DiPetrillo, of course, Mike Osman, especially Jill Gratz from the EFF, Heidi Kuda for her tireless pursuing of ZoomBack to get in contact with me, and everybody else that helped with this talk. Thank you so much for coming.